Hello, hello, hello. It's a little snowy out here. It's a little different than the last episode. Video that I did walking. Beautiful out here though, huh? So I'll have to kind of pay attention to where I'm stepping, make sure I'm not stepping in ice, so I'm not going to be looking at the camera the whole time, I guess. I wanted to talk about today sort of the paradox between the fact that our energy is becoming more certainty, unbending intent, cultivating power makes our will become very rigid, right? I feel like my hat is not on straight or something. So there's our unbending intent, our will, which is our vitality, but at the same time we're thinning out our ego, and our ego is becoming more transparent and essentially malleable by spirit. So how can we have a soft and supple ego and a soft and supple body, and at the same time have an unbending intent and a will that's not to be messed with, right? So an ego that is very thin is a good translator of the spirit. An ego that has more of a here's a bunch of ice. An ego that has more of a thickness to it, has more filters, has more stuff that it has to get through, and then our message is not delivered as clearly, right? Like a very thin ego could take a message from spirit and say, you know, I need to travel to Colorado. A very thick ego can take the same message and interpret it through filters. You know, I need to get away from so-and-so because they are bugging me, right? So we can take a very pure message from spirit and then really distort it, and it turns into something where we are a victim or whatever, and it's just like the ego wants to keep itself intact, it wants to keep its filters intact, and so to disregard the message from spirit, like the original message, means, you know, adding our own meaning on top of something. So this is what's happening all the time, you know. Everybody is a conduit for spirit, but if we don't know how to translate it, if we don't know how our filters are mistranslating it, we have to learn how to stay on top of that. It takes a certain amount of power and adeptness to be able to notice how our filters are just messing things up like that. And so there's this question of, like, you know, how am I supposed to achieve being soft and supple and curious and available and at the same time solid, unbending, rigid, and powerful. And I've seen this come up actually in a recent debate between the Toltec way and the Taoist way, and in my perspective, they're not different. It's two ways of getting to the same thing. So what is the same thing? What are we getting to? What I discovered a long time ago, before I even knew about the Toltec stuff, is before I really started understanding it, was when I got into alignment with my energy in moments, it was like everything was going backward. And I had this realization, I'm like, how can I explain this? Like, all of life is just perceived backward from how it actually is. Right? And the reason I perceived it backward, and I'm just learning this as I'm saying it right now, is because my inner emanations were smaller than the emanations of the external affecting me. And so, my mind, my perception was hyper aware of everything around me, more so than of what I was generating myself. And so if my focus is backward because I'm not focused on what I'm generating, then you can see how all of life appears to be backward because we're just focused with an inversion. Hi! Hi! Thank you. See, that's a good example. I just I don't give two shits about that dog. And then the dog is like, all right, this person doesn't give two shits about me, and so it just walks away. But if my focus was on the external emanations, I would have had some kind of reaction. I'd have some kind of I'd go out of myself as a response to dealing with the situation. But when I stay intact and I'm like, you know what, you can bark at me all you want, my inner emanations are just stronger than that, then whoever's doing the barking is going to be like, oh, this is not the person to mess with. Right? So we're just giving ourselves that gift of being bigger than whatever else is thrown at us. I'm going to go on this swing set, I think. It seems so. There's another dog coming at me, but this one's on a leash. So you could see how I love how there's a real-time example. You can see how my response to, being barked at there was soft and gentle, because I have my rigidity and my unbendingness intact to my will. And so if the inside is solid, the external has no reason to be anything other than kind and gentle, right? Because, oh, there's a pair of shoes here for you. If you need a pair of shoes, that's where to go. The more integrated we are internally, the more kindness we will exude and the more gentleness we will exude. I just noticed I just exceeded the 10 minutes, so I cannot post this whole thing on TikTok in its entirety because there's a 10-minute limit on TikTok. That's okay. On TikTok, I just say, see the complete YouTube video on my YouTube channel. So there's also a certain softness required in approaching aspects of ourselves that are afraid of being overpowered and are afraid of being abused and have a lot of resistance. These traumas cannot stay intact once we become more powerful than they are, right? I like to give the example of PSI, which is pounds per square inch. It's like how much in America, it's how much pressure we have in our tires. I think like a regular car tire has like 35 PSI. So it's a measure of pressure. So if we have a trauma that is held together by 50 PSI, then there are a couple of ways we can approach it. One is through force, pushing it away, and that requires us to have at least 51 PSI to be able to push through it. The other option is through gentleness, which means that we don't have to have 51 PSI in force, in raw force, but we still have to have a degree of presence, and we could potentially have less PSI in presence, maybe like, 35 PSI in presence. We still have to have some kind of significant presence, and so it takes focus and it takes determination to gently go into a trauma, but it takes a little less, and it might take longer, right? It might take months or years to really finesse it, whereas using force is much faster, and if you have the power, it's more efficient. But if you don't have the power, it's like, working on something like that is one way to build the muscle and accumulate the power. So, right, this is all just mechanics. It's just like I'm just giving a physics class here. It's not that complicated. Like, I'm bypassing all of psychology, and I'm bypassing all of the nuances of the human experience that seem to be important and seem to be relevant, but actually they're usually not. There's usually just such an overcomplication. There are times when it's relevant, like, you could say that there's a certain archetype of energy that holds the trauma together. Every trauma is basically one of the 4 archetypes of power, which is You can find it on the Quantum Theater website, which is the PDF on how the quantum theater works. There's the 4 archetypes of power, and that'll show you exactly what is being pushed through. If you can identify which archetype shadow is holding the trauma together, that gives you some kind of psychological relevancy. But if you have enough power, that just stops mattering. It just stops being the issue. Usually it's the case where it's like somebody with enough power is usually assisting somebody who can't get through the trauma on their own, or a plant medicine lends its power. So a plant teacher or a human teacher with sufficient power can move a block, or the individual can develop sufficient power by trying to move the block and failing over and over and over and over again until they get enough power to move it. And blocks because they are appearing as pain. Blocks because they are coming up as something that, for a lot of people it's an external experience. It's like, this person is pissing me off, or this situation is pissing me off. But really, if they look more closely, it's just the pain of that experience, and the pain is internal, and it's a internal block. It's not the circumstance. It's not what it appears to be to the conditioned human mind, or what we call the dream of the world. It's not how do I say this? It's not even a human issue. I'm sure that sounds ridiculous, but when what I mean by that is, it's not a issue to be solved by our human form. Any issue that occurs, trauma, suffering, fear, worry, depression, anxiety, these are all just issues that the human form runs into, because the human form is a product of the dream of the world. And if we try to solve these issues from within the human form, right, like the Einstein quote, like, you cannot blah 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 a blah 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 from the same blah 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 that you blah blah blah'd it, right? That one. I'll try to say it. You cannot solve an issue from the same level of consciousness that created it. What that means, translating here, the human form is very bad at solving problems of the human form. So, you have a trauma, you go to a psychologist, you're like, I'm in this tiny little box. The psychologist is like, well, I'm in a slightly bigger box. And you're like, okay, well, can you help me get out of this small box and get into your medium-sized box? And then the psychologist is like, sure, what I think you really need is some mothering. And, you're worthy, and you're beautiful, and you're so sweet. And it's like, oh, thank you. Thank you for mothering me. Now I'm in a bigger box. I'm still not free, but the pain isn't as pressing on me. So now I have the illusion of freedom until the next thing comes along. Right? So most of the perspective on trauma healing, my mouth is getting a little frozen. I need to keep walking. Trauma healing perspective is that we need to heal this trauma. But what I'm talking about is different, because it is the process of trying to move the stuckness is what builds our power. And I'm seeing if I have a point here. Not really. Maybe I'm just done. I think I'll just keep walking for a minute and see what wants to come up. I want to show you this lake, which is partially freezing over here. I was just standing there, but I forgot to point the camera at it. My friend said that he was at the park, and I came to meet him here, but I did not see him, so he must have left. Gives me more time with you. All right, let's see if you can see the lake from here. It's pretty beautiful, huh? We could go ice fishing. I don't think there's any fish in that lake. Sorry to tell you. You know, I have one teacher who is all about the softness. And it's a woman. And so, you know, when a woman is approaching this stuff, it's especially important to recognize the potency of that superpower, because simultaneously we have to learn how to I was going to say encourage the body to surrender, encouraging the identity, the human animal, the human form to surrender, and at the same time causing our consciousness to become more powerful, to use force, and to pierce through the thought forms of the human animal. So if somebody says surrender, they're correct, and if somebody says use force, they're correct. It's just one is being aimed at the animal and one is being aimed at consciousness. But if the bridge there is the identity. The bridge there is, do I identify as the animal or do I identify as consciousness? Because if I have mostly one or mostly the other, it's going to really change things. Depends how people take the information, right? Learning how to learn is a very important skill. It sounded like I just heard thunder or something, but I don't know. I started writing an article called How to Read. Most people don't know how to benefit from reading. I just realized I have a glove. I can put this glove on my hand. Most people don't know how to benefit from reading because they're reading from the wrong place. They're reading from an intellectual identity, which is just, how can I say it? Doesn't know what to do with the information. Because if we're memorizing stuff, if we're reading a book and memorizing it, it's not going to get us very far. Do I have something on my nose? I always have something on my nose on these videos, don't I? if we are, this is why the Carlos Castaneda books, I'll show you the stone that I'm holding here. It's nice. The Carlos Castaneda books are written in story format. I think for this reason exactly, is because this kind of information has a very hard time landing with the intellect, because what we call in the Toltec the first attention is basically hijacked by the rational mind. So I'll tell you what that means. The first attention is basically our understanding and our identity around what we learn, and the rational mind is more like our instinct, and it's like how we see things based on our level of consciousness. So if the two are blended, I'm kind of just learning this in the past week, is the difference between these. I never really thought about it until like a week ago. If the first attention is hijacked by the rational mind, then we have like a whole skewed belief system. Consciously, like how do I say that? The beliefs we would say, here are my conscious intended beliefs. Somebody who hasn't mastered the first attention, those stated beliefs are just very wonky and incorrect and faulty. Someone will be like, like the law of attraction or something, like, there's these little doggies. I'll show you. Hey. Bye. Someone's like, I feel like if you just really think a lot about money, it will come to you. A stupid belief like that is something someone might genuinely say and own. Oh, this dog is racing me. Hi, Fluffy. And, that probably represents their inner underlying belief of if I behave correctly, I'll be rewarded. Right? So, like the law of attraction, like it has some truth to it, but most people like hear it through such a filter, and it's also like taught through a filter. It's basically taught as the way of saying, if you behave correctly, you'll be rewarded. And that's like the whole premise of that whole spiel.
Lena. Out.
Come on. Nice doggy. Can you see her? So, what I just illustrated is the first attention is, here's what I believe about the law of attraction. The second attention is, here's the underlying belief that causes me to think that or to vibe with that. I forgot where I was going with this now. But Yeah, see, now I can't remember what this whole video is about. Softness and rigidity, I remember that. So our rational mind wants us to be rigid about everything. Even if it's something that is not externally obvious. Like if for example a woman wants to please her man, and so she overly submits even when it's inappropriate, she might be rigid about this belief that this is the right way to do things. That's coming from her rational mind. She might not proclaim that that is her stated preference. Her first attention describes her stated preference. So by noticing where our rational mind and our first attention come into conflict, this is like exactly what highlights a trauma. And of course, a trauma is made up of the rational mind having hijacked the second attention, which is our dreaming attention. We can get more into this in another video, or through my other materials if you want. You see, if I don't have someone to talk to, it can be challenging to know where to go with this. Does that make sense to you? I can't really ask you, so let's hope that it does. Yeah, I guess I'll just wrap up here. But thanks for watching, and be well. Bye.